ESPN's 30 for 30 set out to break the formula of sports documentaries by enlisting independent filmmakers. Now the series celebrates its 15th anniversary. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Not long ago, sports documentaries were largely feel-good stories portraying athletes as heroes. The launch of 30 for 30 changed that. The original concept was to produce 30 documentaries for the 30th anniversary of ESPN in 2010. The network recruited award-winning directors such as Steve James, Barbara Koppel, and John Singleton. Their films were individual, complex, and earned a reputation for quality. One of the best-known titles is O.J. Made in America, that won an Oscar. 30 for 30 lasted well beyond one season. ESPN has produced over 100 films and dozens of shorts under the label. Last week at the DGA Theater in New York City, I hosted a conversation putting a spotlight on 3 new 30 for 30 titles. I was joined by the 3 film teams, along with Marsha Cooke, the executive producer of ESPN Films. I'll describe each project as we go along. The first is the 4-part series, The Luckiest Guy in the World, about basketball legend Bill Walton. In the 1960s, Walton was a star college player at UCLA. On campus, he was drawn deeply into the politics of the era, protesting the Vietnam War, smoking pot, and becoming a devoted fan of the Grateful Dead. After college, he was drafted by the Portland Trail Blazers. He befriended the radical writer Jack Scott, who gained infamy for helping Patty Hearst when she was on the run for armed bank robbery with her kidnappers in the Symbionese Liberation Army. The FBI questioned Walton over his relationship to Jack Scott. It was a highly unusual situation for an NBA basketball player. That's exactly the kind of complicated history that makes a great 30 for 30 story, and it's only a small segment of Walton's eventful life. In episode 2 of the series, director Steve James tells Walton that his association with Jack Scott seems like a break from mainstream America. Walton pushes back.
I'm as mainstream as they come.
You weren't then.
I vote in every election. I express my feelings. I'm an engaged citizen. I'm a neighbor in a community. I'm part of a team. What is more mainstream than that?
So Jack Scott is someone whose ideas were clearly not in the mainstream. And when the whole Patty Hearst thing happened,
Yep.
you stood by Jack's side,
Right.
very publicly.
Right. Jack was my friend. Jack needed a friend.
Steve James joined me on stage, along with his ESPN producer, Marquis Daisy. I asked Steve what drew him to Bill Walton in the first place.
Well, I'm old enough to have watched Bill when he was at UCLA play. I didn't live in LA, I lived in Virginia, but they would show the games after the late news where I lived from Pauley Pavilion. So I kind of fell in love with him as a player then and just kind of followed his career, including his off-the-court stuff was always fascinating to me. And then when ESPN reached out to me and said, would you be interested in doing this story, I was like, yeah. And I read Bill's memoir, which is great, and that became the basis for the series that we made. And I think that Bill, and I think this episode sort of shows that. I think Bill is arguably the most visible public white athlete. Very important distinction. White athlete that we've had that speaks out politically in this country. It's not very common, and certainly not among athletes of his stature. And I always thought that was a really interesting part of his story that would be very important to feature in this story.
So Marquis is the producer on this. I should say that in this longer history that we're celebrating of 30 for 30, you have made other contributions, including you directed the film Rand University. What drew you to working on a story about Bill Walton?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I grew up a basketball fan. and used to play basketball. Feels like a long time ago. But I think similar to Steve, like I watched Bill Walton from afar. And I was pretty young and being a fan of him. But I was always just curious about Bill Walton, the person. There's always, they always say your heroes, you watch them on television, but you're getting one thing. You're getting them on a pedestal in terms of like what they provide as a hero on the athletic fields. I grew up as someone who's just always been curious about the person behind the success. And I think that, when I found out that Steve was going to be working on his film, I was just really pumped up about it because just being a fan of his work, I know that he gets to the crux of like who the person is. And just doing the research and, just sort of trying to figure out who Bill Walton was, I just knew that we were in for a very sneaky, great film. And I think that, the audience was going to come into this just unaware of the layers to who he was. And I think that's what drew me to the subject. Originally, it was just kind of like, we think we know who he is as sort of like this athlete, but he's just multi-layered, and there was just so much to him. And I think, working with Steve, it just made a lot of sense because I think he brought that, he humanized, one of my childhood sort of people that I looked up to.
So, Steve, I want to ask about what it took to get there. On the surface, Bill Walton seems to be a super open guy, but we do see, especially in this episode, there are certain parts of his history that that maybe are less accessible, or even some of his oldest friends have never really gotten to the bottom of. There's a great moment where you are kind of gingerly asking him to read something, and it sounds from your voice that you're not sure how this is going to go. So can you talk about what it meant to get at the things that weren't being easily served to you?
Yeah, well, in a way, his memoir was a good way to prepare for what he didn't want to talk about. Because the memoir is great, but there are things, there's no discussion of Patty Hearst. There's no discussion of Jack Scott. There's some discussion of protesting at UCLA, a little bit of that, but nothing like nothing like that letter that he eventually reads for us there, in terms of the level of criticism that he had towards, capitalism and the American government. So I knew that was not going to be an easy thing to get him to do, and it became, with these kind of things, I also knew that I didn't want to just sit down, which is more typical for biographies, is generally speaking, you maybe will have generally two major interviews with your subject, right? One huge one at the beginning, and then another one that you do later in the process when you get the stuff you missed. I knew that wouldn't work with Bill. Bill is a raconteur. Bill loves to talk. You ask him one question, he'll talk for 20 minutes. And I knew that just wasn't going to work, and that, so I also strategized about when we would get to certain topics. And I would tell him, like today, I probably interviewed him a dozen times, and I told him, we're going to talk to you a lot. And today we're going to talk about UCLA, and today we're going to talk about the Clippers, it's a later episode. But this part about, I waited much later in the process before I really tried to draw him out on it, because I knew we would have to be at a place where he would hopefully be willing to go with it.
Marquis, you said that one of the things that attracted you to this job was being able to work with Steve, whose career includes Hoop Dreams. Steve was on the first season of 30 for 30, his film about Allen Iverson. What did you get to observe about Steve's approach to filmmaking?
Don't be honest.
I think one of the things that I've really taken away from this experience is just a commitment to understanding that you go into a film sort of with a rudimentary understanding of what the subject is, but you're going to unlock so much of it. And I think that's what Steve was able to sort of figure out as he was, interviewing Bill, but also just, identifying sort of different narratives that came along with what he wanted to do. This film has grown. It grew from essentially, sort of a standalone idea to an experience. And it ultimately became this multi-part series that was
Did you not know it was going to be 4 parts when you started?
No, I mean, I think, Bill, I think...
It's Steve James.
Yeah. I think Steve, I think he went on a journey with Bill Walton. He went on a journey with him. And I think he just, as he started to figure out, where he wanted to go with the film, I think he just really just started to unlock just all of, these different aspects of, his life that I think, and not to speak for you, but I think that, he just knew that this would be revelatory for the audience. And that works for 30 for 30 as well. I think we pride ourselves on that, right? People coming into an experience thinking that they know the subject, but really learning so much more. So I saw this whole process just sort of really grow along the way. And I just took from him just, never, sort of settle for thinking that the subject 100%, because even as a filmmaker, it's inevitable that you're going to learn along the way as well. And the story changes. And I just saw that firsthand, for sure.
I'll just add one thing. I think one of the hallmarks of the 30 for 30 series across the board, starting 15 years ago up till now, is digging beneath the sports story. That it's not, I think one of the reasons why Marsha, I think, wanted to show this episode is because this is an example of an episode, but something that's typical of a 30 for 30, which is to dig deeper into what else is going on in this story besides the on-the-court exploits. And when I first met Marsha, one of the first things she said to me, and I don't know if you remember this, was, "Are you dealing with the racism in Portland?" And I said, yes, because it was a racist community. And we don't tend to think of Portland that way now. We think of it as this kind of, really liberal, which it is, and it was really liberal then, but it was still racist. And so you had spent time in Portland, so she knew about that. She hadn't just read about it, she'd seen it, and she wanted to make sure that the series showed that as well.
So, Marsha, let me ask you, this year 15 of 30 for 30, you have come in and taken charge of this series. What do you see as the role of 30 for 30 right now, 15 years into this?
To keep evolving. We never want to rest on our laurels. I think everyone here on some level appreciates the work that we've done historically, but it's got to keep innovating. You want to tell different stories. We believe in audience expansion, so telling different kinds of stories, but always staying true to that beautiful intersection between culture and sport. But I do think that it's important for us to expand our not only our reach, but who we work with, the directors, behind the camera, diverse voices. All of those things I think are going to be important for the next 15 years. But we've got an extraordinary team. The people that we work with are just wonderful and smart and delightful. And we really deeply believe in the point of view of the directors that we work with. That's what I think makes us different. That is never going to change. We want directors to come with a particular vision, and it is our job to support that vision.
That was ESPN Films executive producer Marsha Cooke. Now we turn to another 30 for 30 title, Minister of Defense. The film profiles American football player Reggie White, who had a zeal for sacking quarterbacks. He helped the Green Bay Packers win the Super Bowl in 1997. White centered his life around Christianity. He was a charismatic preacher who used his football fame to spread his religious views, including some he came to regret. After retiring from football, he started to question his own views. He expressed his self-doubts in an interview that he gave to NFL Films in 2004, just a couple months before he died. We'll hear some of that interview in this clip from Minister of Defense.
I got convinced that this is what God wanted me to do, and that football will be a good way to get this message out. God brought me here, and Lord Jesus, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. But maybe I was wrong. By your merit, Elohim, and I say that in that when I look on it now, I misled people. Dear God, and that's where the problem lies. Amen. Now my greatest fear is that now I know I got to sit down and get it right.
The film's directors are Ken Rodgers and Courtland Bragg. Ken is an executive producer for NFL Films. He's directed 9 projects for 30 for 30. Courtland is a rising talent who cut his teeth working on the series Hard Knocks about football training camps. I asked Ken why he wanted to focus on Reggie White.
We did an interview with Reggie White that I was part of my second or third year at NFL Films back in 2004. And at the time, there was no 30 for 30. There was, sports programming, and then there was documentaries. To me, at that time, you thought Frontline and the films of Miss Koppel and all these incredibly thoughtful, artistic things. And we did this interview, and he admitted that he was studying the Torah, and he was no longer going to a Christian church, which was incredible. He was learning the language, the Hebrew language, and it was incredible, and also had no spot in any of our NFL programming. We said, well, what do we do with this? It's really not appropriate to put on the programs that we have already. Luckily, 30 for 30 came around, and luckily Marsha arrived, and it really became a slam dunk in my head to answer that question I always had, which is, what was going on with Reggie right before he died? The interview was a month before he passed away.
At the age of 43.
At the age of 43, in the midst of totally redefining who he was as a person and his faith, and discovering a whole nother way of looking at the things he thought he believed. He was the most convicted person you could ever think of. He knew how he felt about religion, about himself, about football. And at the end of his life, he started saying, maybe I was wrong. And that was fascinating to me. And I was lucky enough to know that the man sitting to my right grew up the son of a preacher. And we started talking at NFL Films about, there's that interview. It used to be talked about as that Reggie interview. And we decided to resurface it and bring it to ESPN. And I'm so thankful that they gave us the opportunity to tell that, because 20 years ago we couldn't. And I really think that 30 for 30 has changed the landscape of documentaries. I'd say this is the era of 30 for 30, and I hope it keeps growing to be that way, in that it brought accessibility to those sort of issues, religion, race, all the things that Reggie's film involves, combined with just entertainment, with football, with sports, which used to just be highlights, used to just be, if a great doc came around, it was societal. It wasn't necessarily about the famous athletes. The combination of the two is something that 30 for 30 changed, and I think you look at offerings everywhere, content-wise, and it's because they changed it 15 years ago, and Reggie is perfect proof that some stories are still out there that someone's sitting on. And if you know any, come to me, not Steve.
So, Courtland, Ken talked about this journey that Reggie White went on in his life. And for people who haven't seen the film, can you describe what that journey was, the convictions he started out with and the ones he started to question?
Yeah, so Reggie grew up in the South in the Baptist church, Christian faith, and all through his life he preached the word of God and spread the gospel in locker rooms, on the field. Reggie was one of the players, as we see today, after a game, players congregate at the middle of the field to pray. Well, Reggie was the first to do that. And as Reggie stepped away from football, he had nothing but time to really reevaluate his life, where he was going. And as he started to delve into the Word of God in the Bible, he started to question things. And he felt that a lot of things he was preaching and a lot of his views were things that he heard in the church he didn't really know for himself. So as he started to study more and more, he started to realize that maybe he was misled and he was misleading people. So he wanted to see the Bible how God spoke to Moses and those in the Bible. And as he started to read the Torah and learn the Hebrew language, he saw the Bible and the gospel in a way different way. And it really transcended and changed his perspective. And he went on a full crusade to learn more of his own truth. And Ken had spoke about it, but you knew that you talked to his family, you talked to people that knew Reggie, he was on to something. And sadly, he suddenly passes away. So it's a fascinating story of someone who was searching for his whole life, searching for his truth. And just one thing I want to just say is, seldomly do you do a film or a project and you're so emotionally attached and it changes the way you think. You know, I grew up in the church. My dad's a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor. My great-great-grandfather was a pastor. Don't think I'm gonna be pastor. I like telling films, but
Preach, Courtland. Preach.
Don't tell my parents that they think I'm the next one. But it made me think of, you know, why do I grow up? You know, when I open a Bible, I read the New King James Version. Why? Well, that's how I was taught to believe in the church. So as I was working on this film with Ken, I started to reevaluate my truth and like, well, maybe I need to kind of find things and dig a little bit deeper. So this film completely changed my life in so many ways, but it allowed me to continue to search for my own truth.
The third and final film on this panel is The Great Heisman Race of 1997. It looks at a controversial year for the Heisman Trophy, the top award in college football. In 1997, there were several leading candidates, including Tennessee quarterback Peyton Manning and the University of Michigan's Charles Woodson, who played both offense and defense. The film relies entirely on archival footage, without interlaying any new interviews or commentary. That approach harkens back to the first season of 30 for 30, when it was tried out by director Brett Morgan in a film called June 17, 1994. For The Great Heisman Race of 1997, the film team distills a year's worth of television coverage. I was joined by the film's producer, Carolyn Hepburn. I asked her what made 1997 so unique.
Well, in 1997, this race is still hotly debated today. And it has 3 out of the 4 finalists, 3 of them are pro Hall of Famers. Going into the season, everybody thought Peyton Manning was going to get the Heisman Trophy.
And we're not going to say who got it in 1997.
Should I not say? Okay.
Yeah, you gotta keep
Don't
Google.
but it was a great class. The finalists were Peyton Manning, Charles Woodson, Randy Moss, and Ryan Leaf. And what's really fun about it's just like a huge nostalgia trip, this film. It's kind of, for those of you who kind of know our first season, I'm going to call out a film that is having its anniversary next week, June 17th, 1994. So it's really in line of really being in the moment, not having modern day people reflect and give perspective of what happened there. The whole season unfolds kind of as it happened, and it's just like this great fun romp. And okay, I'm not going to give the ending away, so. But there is an ending that was very unexpected that is still hotly debated.
Marsha, I want to ask about the Some of the trickiness of 30 for 30, giving these individual filmmakers as much free reign as you can. Also, as a sports brand, you have to maintain other kinds of relationships with the NFL and MLB and with athletes who sometimes have their own ideas about how stories should get told. So how do you balance that, between letting filmmakers tell the stories they want to tell and having other powerful forces who say, like, well, wait, don't tell the story so candidly?
It's the great question of our time. It's not easy. Oftentimes you're lucky that you work with wonderful directors who are willing to take feedback. Sometimes you have like a couple conversations where you say, wait, what? Really? Are you seriously thinking about that? I'm looking at you. But we're best friends now, so it's all good. It's difficult, but it's fun. I think that obviously the game has changed. We're not the only guys in town anymore. Athletes are their brands. They have their own production companies. But I think that what we provide them is wonderful individuals, producers like Carolyn and Marquis. We have an unbelievable team. So we work really hard to find that balance. I think we understand that our role is a little bit of family mediator, if you will, and understanding talent, and that talent can be the athlete, that talent can also be the director, and then also the larger vision of what it is that we want to accomplish, which is to get a really terrific film out there. So am I answering your question? Not completely, because there are also the leagues that we deal with, and it's always it's always something that we consider, but we really strive for independence and working with entities like NFL Films, where we know that there may be other perspectives that might want to have a say. But I think that we really do our best to talk about what is most important, and that is the fan. Our chairman just today had a town hall where he talked about our mission is to support the fan and to provide as much as we can to satisfy the thirst that the fan has for these kinds of films. So it's a delicate dance, is all I'll say, but I think that we do it masterfully, and we have for the last 15 years.
Ken, you were reacting to that. You work within the institution of NFL Films, so you know multiple different institutions. Before I get your take on that, there may be people here who don't really know what NFL Films is, so I think it'd be worth you just saying what NFL Films is.
Sure. NFL Films became the official filmmaking arm of the National Football League. We started shooting games in 1962. Not we. I wasn't born. You weren't born. But in 1962, Ed and Steve Sable started making highlight films. And they became so successful, airing in local churches and on CBS once in a while, that the league decided to create its own media arm, its own filmmaking team. And this is 20 years before ESPN. And I think it helped build what the sports landscape looks like today. Steve and Ed Sable were the first to wire players and coaches during games. They created that cinematic universe of slow motion mixed with orchestral music. They had their own style. And now we are kind of backing that style out. I like to say Steve passed away 13 years ago, and he left on his desk, which still sits at NFL Films, a sign that says, keep tradition by breaking tradition. And so we spent a lot of time in the 70s building players up to be mythic and heroic, and it was very highlighty and very, that name you see is actually a great man who has no flaws. We kind of created mythos of an NFL player. And now we're backing that out and going against our tradition and saying, let's look at some of the realities of how they're not just a name on the uniform. There's a person underneath who deals with the same things that we all deal with. And I will say, to sort of back up what Marsha says, the NFL at NFL Films has never come to us and said, no, don't do that with ESPN, or let us watch it first. They actually don't watch the films. They trust us, and they only do that with this project, with ESPN, with 30 for 30, because they know, well, we're not going to put a restrictor on the 30 for 30 brand. And that's very, very rare that the National Football League would say, hey, we trust the filmmakers at NFL Films, we trust the filmmakers at ESPN. Some stories now need to be told. And I know we're going to continue telling them. And it's been a blessing that we get to tell the stories the right way or a different way than we did back in the 70s.
Courtland, when we were on a call a week or so ago talking about this panel, you talked about the excitement you had as, you're not as old as these other guys, so you're kind of emerging into this 30 for 30 tradition, and what does that mean to you?
Oh, it means everything. When 30 for 30 came out, I was in high school, and it was one of the. Let that
sink in.
30 for 30 helped me fall in love with storytelling, and full circle, 15 years later, just to be able to sit on this panel and learn from one of the greatest teammates you can ever have in Ken Rodgers, whose reputation speaks for itself, and not only to do a 30 for 30, but do a film that really speaks to who I am. It just, after the show aired, I looked myself in the mirror. I was like, how do you go from here? Like you have done everything that your heart has desired. So and to be able to see my name and be able to be a part of this project with Ken, it was like a dream come true.
It brings us back to the theme of the night of being lucky, and probably I've heard that expressed by all of you who've gotten to be part of the 30 for 30 tradition. The luck to have that opportunity. Steve, let me ask you about the title, "The Luckiest Guy in the World." It's a expression that you challenge Bill Walton on in this film. What does it mean to be lucky? When did you know that this was going to be called "The Luckiest Guy in the World"?
It kind of came pretty early in the process because Bill said it about 50 times a day, and it wasn't. It was interesting because in the first few interviews, literally at the end of every question, he'd say it. And I kind of, at one point I said, Bill, you don't have to say it at the end of every answer. And he was like, but I'm the luckiest guy in the world. And it dawned on us, there that like this isn't just something he says. It's something he's trying to live. It's his mantra. Because clearly he hasn't been the luckiest guy in the world by any stretch in terms of his career as an athlete, and also in other ways. He's had many struggles, and we knew we were going to get into those. And so we wanted, as you watch the film, to reflect on that title and reflect the various meanings that it has in the context of this film, but also in terms of his life, because it's his way of coping with all of his bad luck, is to assert as much for himself as for us that he's the luckiest guy in the world.
I want to thank all of our guests, Steve James and Marquis Daisy, behind The Luckiest Guy in the World, Ken Rodgers and Courtland Bragg, who directed Minister of Defense, Carolyn Hepburn, the producer of the Great Heisman Race of 1997, and ESPN Films executive producer Marsha Cooke. You can watch all these films on ESPN+. We recently launched a newsletter called Doc Voices, written by Anisha Javeri. You'll find Doc Voices on Substack. If you want to advertise to our 40,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, partnership manager Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.